A stark question has been posed. What is the truth about the U.S. war in Afghanistan? Classified documents released by the Washington Post reveal top U.S. officials have consistently lied about the Afghan war and misled the public throughout the 18-year campaign of what is now America's longest war. So what has been revealed, and what are the likely consequences for all concerned? To talk about these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Professor Wang Jin, Associate Professor at Northwest University of China. We'll also be speaking with Lailuma Nasiri, co-founder and vice president of the Afghanistan Justice Organization via satellite, and also via Skype to Peter Kuznick, professor of history and director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University in Washington. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Li Qiuyuan, sitting in for Yang Rui. All right, so Professor, let's talk about this. On Monday, the Washington Post published this extensive analysis based on previously classified documents, thousands of them, and also interviews involving the U.S. war in Afghanistan. The paper not only shows that the U.S. policy under President George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump failed to bring peace and modernization to Afghanistan, but also these policymakers were aware that such an outcome were highly unlikely while lying to the public, saying, painting a rosier picture about progress made. What were your takeaway from these papers? What does that reveal to you about U.S. strategies and its foreign policy decision-making?
Well, actually, for me, if we looked at Afghanistan, I think actually it's just a reviewed a result of actually wide-known result, because everybody knows that the United States is actually very difficult to win inside Afghanistan, because no matter, George W. Bush, no matter Barack Obama, or even Donald Trump himself, I think every time when they speak, we want to win, we want to change something in Afghanistan, but actually if we see the results, if we see the battlefield, if we see the rise of Taliban and other insurgent groups inside Afghanistan, if we see how much the Afghanistan central government can control the territories inside their state. So actually, if we look at the figures, look at the casualties, look how many bombs we released by the United States. So that is something that cannot happen. That's something that cannot make that if the United States, as the United States described, that we will win. So I think this kind of the media, as what you release, is just telling the public that actually the result has already been recognized. Not publicly recognized before as officials and experts in the Afghanistan, also inside the United States. But actually, this is the shocking news, because it shows to the world, it shows to the United States public that, okay, we're not going to win the war, but actually they are still telling the lies for nearly more than a decade.
Right, and I just want to read this quote to our viewers. The Washington Post said, "The war in Afghanistan has gone on for 18 years at an enormous cost, lives, injuries, and money, and the public is entitled to know whether officials were straight with them about the war effort. Through 3 years of persistence by Craig Whitlock and our lawyers, the public now knows that the truth was a casualty of the war from the very beginning." This is from the Post. Now, Ms. Nasiri, let me get your thoughts on this. You are in Kabul. How are you looking at this? What kind of reactions are we getting from there?
Thank you. Well, at this juncture of time, the release of the Afghanistan paper, I think, is not a kind of a shock in Kabul for the people here, but it definitely is a shock for the people of the United States of America, because the policymakers of the U.S. has lied to the people of America, and that has been since long time. And the release of the Afghanistan paper is such kind of release of the papers are not the first time. So, but instead of the great shock that it should make in Afghanistan, instead of that, the recent yesterday's attack at the Americans' base in Bagram has created a lot of media reaction and people's reaction. Especially when the Taliban and the Americans have started negotiations in Doha for the second round after a very long delay of a few months. So at this juncture of time, I think what people can feel is, and what people think is, we are looking forward to the news from the ongoing negotiations in Doha between the Taliban and the Americans. And instead of that, we also are thinking of how come at this juncture of time the Afghanistan paper release happens, and also an attack happens on the American base in Bagram. Of course, the people of Afghanistan understand that there are always spoilers to the peace process in Afghanistan. Internal and external elements are there, and this can be an action of the external or internal elements to harm the peace process in Afghanistan, and that's what we think.
All right, so a shocking revelation to the American public, but not so much a shock for people in Afghanistan. Professor Kuznick in Washington, let me bring you in. So you feel that in understanding this war, we have to look at some of the crucial contacts, and you find U.S. provoking the Soviet Union into entering Afghanistan, excuse me, in 1970s, and the U.S. support for the Mujahideen in 1980s, as well as the neoconservatives' fantasy surrounding the invasion, excuse me, of Afghanistan in 2001 are the things we cannot overlook when examining the U.S. invasion. Why are we coming to this stage? Can you elaborate on that, please?
Well, the U.S. has a long history in Afghanistan, and it's pretty much a sordid history. You asked about the reaction in Afghanistan to these Washington Post exposés. The thing that's important to understand is that to those of us in the United States who have been paying attention, this is no surprise at all. Let me put it in two contexts. First of all, this is not the first war the United States has been lied into. Since 1898 and the Spanish-American War, the United States has been lied into pretty much every war that it's ever participated in. So in 1898, World War I, even Franklin Roosevelt in World War II, which was a necessary war, was rife with lies. The Vietnam War was a pack of lies from the beginning. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Well, with Afghanistan, what the Washington Post exposed is just that, again, much like in Vietnam and other wars, the government was not being honest with the American people, not being honest about motives, and not being honest about the way the war was being conducted. It was lying brazenly, openly, deliberately. The American involvement begins in the 1970s. There was a revolution in Pakistan, or a change in government, in 1978, and a very pro-Soviet government took office. There was faction fighting. The United States, seeing the faction fighting, understood that if they could support the Mujahideen, then they could get them to intervene in a way that would force the Soviets to intervene into Afghanistan. And so the United States started to work with elements in Pakistan to attempt to overthrow the government in Afghanistan at that point. When the Soviets finally invaded on Christmas Day 1979, the United States publicly said, "This is terrible, this is horrible." Privately, the Americans were drinking champagne and toasting. Brzezinski, the national security advisor to Jimmy Carter, said, "Now we've given the Soviets their own Vietnam." And so the Americans began aiding the Mujahideen before the Soviet invasion, militarily aiding them, and politically and strategically aiding them. And what was the Mujahideen's complaint about the reform government? Their major complaint was that they were educating women. So the people the United States was supporting were the ones who were opposed to this pro-Soviet government educating women, conducting land reform, and industrializing in this very backward country, a country that had a life expectancy at the time of 40 years, a country in which 10% of the people were able to read. And so you had a government that was trying to deal with those problems, and the U.S. intervened to try to overthrow that government. The Soviets stupidly took the bait, and that ruined the end of détente between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And Brezhnev said, well, It'll take us 3 to 4 weeks to win. He was in for a big surprise. And during that time, the United States began working with these extreme Islamist fundamentalists. The United States was helping train them, arm them, and those were many of the same people, including Osama bin Laden, who were then going to blow back on the United States in 9/11, with the attack on 9/11. So the U.S. has a long history of being involved in Afghanistan, which is really the Soviet territory, Soviet sphere of influence, and the United States has used that to work with these extreme Islamist elements in order to disrupt the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And this latest round, what we've seen from the Washington Post, is that lie after lie after lie. They did not know what they were doing there. They shouldn't have even been involved there in the first place. According to the U.S. CIA station chief in Pakistan, the Taliban government in Afghanistan was eager to give up Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda. They wanted the U.S. to assist them in doing that in order to save face. And the U.S. had a lot of meetings with the Taliban before the U.S. invaded Afghanistan, but the U.S. did not understand the situation. So like in Vietnam, like these other situations we get involved in, partly the American ignorance and the American willingness to go to war, to look for military solutions, led us into this quagmire in Afghanistan, and the result has been a disaster for 18 years, almost 19 years now. Yeah. It's been a very, very unfortunate situation in which so many lives have been lost.
About why U.S. troops were there among officials and generals, but having known that context, the history and past, what's going to happen next? How this is going to impact what's going to happen next? Ms. Missouri, just remember, not too long ago, Donald Trump just made a surprise visit to U.S. military base in Afghanistan on Thanksgiving Day and said that Taliban wanted to make a deal. How will the Afghan paper affect the Taliban's will and strategy now for talking with the U.S.? What would that mean for the intra-Afghan talks and peace building there?
Well, yes, after the American president surprise visit on Thanksgiving Day to Bagram, he did say that the Taliban badly wanted to talk and discuss the peace process in Afghanistan. Looking at the current situation and that the government, the U.S. government has already started negotiations with Taliban in Doha, I don't think that the Afghanistan paper release will impact much, depending on or provided that the U.S. government is how serious about ending the war in Afghanistan and making a deal with Taliban. Of course, if these papers cause a damage to the process that has just started, there is no point in thinking even of the intra-Afghan negotiations or intra-Afghan talks between Taliban and the Afghan government. But if like many other instances in the past when such revelations were in place, if this time the release of the papers go as it went before, I think the negotiations will go on, and there may be an opportunity then, if the agreement is made between the U.S. and the Taliban, for the intra-Afghan negotiations as well. We are more in Afghanistan. We are more thinking of how come at this time the paper release and also the explosion or the attack that happened in Bagram. These can make us worry a lot, because even 2-3 months back, when President Trump's tweet stopped the negotiation process, when it had already reached to a final decision to be made, I think that's what we are thinking at this moment, right now, that if anything happens from the U.S. government, if the release of this paper impacts the process, of course it damages the whole process, and the people of Afghanistan are now waiting for how the negotiations between the Taliban and the U.S. government would result, what exact decisions or agreements they will reach.
Now, the Washington Post also said that John Sopko, the head of the Office of the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, told the paper that the report shows the American people have constantly been lied to. And here's another quote. This is from Daniel Ellsberg, an American military analyst and researcher. It says, in both the Afghan War and the Vietnam War, the presidents and generals had a pretty realistic view of what they were up against, which they did not want to admit to the American people. Now, Professor Kuznick, the latest revelation does recall the famous previous incident known as the Pentagon Papers, in which similar revelations were made by the New York Times about the Vietnam War. How do you compare the two? Would you expect these latest revelations to have the same effect as the Pentagon Papers?
Well, you know, Dan Ellsberg is one of my closest friends, and he's the one who released the Pentagon Papers in 1971. Dan understood that the American government, president after president, but especially Johnson and Nixon, had been lying to the American people about the prospects for winning and about what would happen, what had to happen if the United States was going to actually defeat the communists in Vietnam. And the American presidents would not be honest with the American people. They knew that there was no chance to win, really, and they still kept sending thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of American troops over there. And so Dan tried to get members of Congress to release the Pentagon Papers, which was a secret history of the war that was ordered by Secretary of Defense McNamara. And so Dan finally, out of desperation, made copies of the papers and distributed them to American newspapers. The New York Times started to publish them in 1971, and then the Nixon administration got an injunction to block the New York Times. So then Dan got them to the Washington Post, and then the Washington Post started to publish it, and then the administration blocked that. It ended up getting it to 17 more newspapers also, and finally the Supreme Court said, we can publish this. At that point, the American people already knew that the government had been lying. Again, in this situation, you know what's different is that in Vietnam, there was a great degree of understanding and concern throughout the public about the U.S. invasion of Vietnam. There is no similar understanding and concern about the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan. In the United States in the late 60s and early 70s, there were constant demonstrations on campus, in the cities, in the streets, letters to the editor, people organizing against the Vietnam War. I don't think you can find demonstrations on any campus in the United States today in opposition to the Afghan war. One of the things the American government and the military learned from Vietnam is that if you have a small volunteer army, goes in there and does it in a way that's not in the news all the time, that the American people won't pay attention. So sadly, the Pentagon Papers did have an impact, but we were several years into the war, and there was already a lot of concern about the war. There was a lot of concern about Afghanistan in the beginning, but there's been very little concern about U.S. involvement in Afghanistan since then. And that, to me, is unconscionable for the American people to be using their tax dollars to support a war in which hundreds of thousands of people have been killed and to not be paying attention to this. So is this going to have a similar impact to the Pentagon Papers? I don't think so.
Well, that's an incredible behind-the-scene story we get from you on the Pentagon paper. But Professor Wan, what's your thoughts on what's been said there? Why were previous lessons forgotten or disregarded, as Professor Kuznick mentioned?
because I think for the United States political culture, there is a very deeply rooted problem that they are too confident. They are too confident that their political notion, their political ideas should be and could be borrowed by the other nations, and could be copied by the other nations, by the other cultures, no matter what kind of cultures and how different the social and cultural circumstances the given state are or is. So that is why we see that the United States made a mistake in the Vietnam, and also that's why also we see the United States made this very similar mistake in Afghanistan and Iraq and other parts of the world. So I think that is why when we look back to the history, very similar scenarios. I mean, erupted once and once again when no lessons actually learned by the political leaders inside the United States. I think that's very, very tragedy for the United States.
Right. And Professor Kuznick, certainly many Americans are aware that the U.S. government hid facts from the public during the Vietnam War and was dishonest about Iraq's alleged possession of weapons of mass destruction, which led directly to the U.S. invasion in 2003. Now, given the latest evidence, the revelation then, what kind of spillover effect could this have toward U.S. strategies? What does this mean for U.S. troops still stationed in Afghanistan? What do you think?
I think, well, Trump had said during the campaign that he wanted to pull U.S. troops out of Afghanistan. Basically, Obama had said spoke similarly during his campaign before he became president, and neither of them has done so. Obama doubled down. He increased American troops from 35 or 50,000 when he took office to more than 100,000. Trump has said he's going to pull out the American troops, but we still have 13,000 there, and he hasn't done so. Maybe this, if he seriously wants to pull U.S. troops out of Afghanistan, maybe this will give him some of the cover to do so. He likes to talk about the deep state. You know, he says it's attacking him, which is nonsense, basically. But clearly, what President Eisenhower identified as the military-industrial complex, it does have a very big influence and control over U.S. policy. This goes back not to that military-industrial complex, but to the neoconservatives of the George W. Bush administration, some people in the Project for a New American Century. So they were the ones who oversaw the invasion of Afghanistan. But they had a hit list. If you look at Hadley and Wolfowitz and Cheney and the others around them, they said, well, first we take Afghanistan, then we invade Iraq and overthrow the government there, then we invade Libya, then we invade Syria, then we invade Iran. They had a list of all these countries that they wanted to topple. And as Wang Jin has said, the Americans were hubristic. They believed that they could do anything they wanted. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the idea was, that, according to Charles Krauthammer, a leading neoconservative thinker, that this is the unipolar moment. After we invaded Afghanistan, he said, no, that was wrong. This is the unipolar era. It's not going to last 30 or 40 years. It could last hundreds of years, that the U.S. will be able to dictate anything it wants all over the world. Well, things started to go well initially in Afghanistan, but pretty soon after the U.S. invaded Iraq, things started to fall apart. And the Americans lost interest in Afghanistan. The Bush administration was much more concerned about Iraq, and then Syria and Libya and Iran and all the other countries that they wanted to topple. So it's this hubristic, this kind of arrogance that the Americans have had, that we have the right to bomb places anywhere, and we have the power to do that, and nobody can challenge us. And so then you look, the United States is currently bombing 7 different countries. Right? Who else does that, behaves like that? It's sad to say, President Jimmy Carter recently said that the United States is the most violent force in the world, that nobody else behaves like this. Martin Luther King said the same thing. He said the United States, the American government, is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. I'm not happy to say that. I don't want to see my country be playing that kind of role. But Afghanistan is only symptomatic of a broader problem. And the use of military force does not solve problems. It creates more problems, as we've seen in Afghanistan and Iraq and other parts of the world. Libya is a good example.
And Washington resumed talks with the Taliban in Qatar recently. Ms. Nassiri, 3 months after President Donald Trump abruptly halted diplomatic efforts that could end America's longest war. Are you hopeful that this war could soon end via a peace deal?
Well, I'm certainly
Well,
Ms. Nassiri in
looking at the
Kabul.
current situation in Afghanistan and all this.
Go ahead.
Looking at the current situation in Afghanistan and the discussions that are ongoing since 1 year in regards to the peace in Afghanistan, and also looking at the Americans' will for withdraw from Afghanistan and end the war is one question. But looking at the current situation in Afghanistan, discussions with Taliban or peace negotiations with Taliban without having the Afghan government involved and the involvement of the people of Afghanistan, I think is not very hopeful in regards to whether it will end actually the war or no. Besides, it's not only the Taliban, the issue of the Afghan security. It's also tens of the international terrorist groups operating in Afghanistan. Biggest of them is the IS, which is growing in terms of population and in terms of power. So keeping all these facts in mind on the ground, I hope I don't sound very negative, but I'm not very hopeful that the peace agreement with Taliban will actually bring peace into Afghanistan.
Have the Taliban revised their demands in the negotiation with the U.S. and Afghanistan government? Ms. Nassiri, again, what are the core challenges in this peace negotiation?
Well, we have very little information about what Taliban thinks and what Taliban are basically planning, because other than the few tweets that we see, there is no much information on the process. So we actually don't know whether they have revised the demands, but with looking at the current situation, it looks like they have not changed their demands, but instead the U.S. government has agreed and accepted a few of their demands. For instance, when the negotiation or the peace talks 2-3 months before were stopped, Taliban multiple times through the media requested the U.S. government to restart the negotiations from where it has ended. They didn't want to start it from the scratch, and it looks like the current peace process negotiations with Taliban have not started from the scratch, but have started from where it had ended. Besides, Taliban were demanding the release of their important prisoners with the Afghan government, and those 3 have already been released in exchange for the 2 professors from the American University in Afghanistan. So looking at those things, I think it seems like Taliban have not changed their demand, but instead they are stick to what they had demanded at the beginning. And recently, the piece of the news that we heard was that Taliban will prepare the opportunity or provide an opportunity for the exit of the U.S. military when the agreement is signed between the Taliban and the U.S. government. So that's what we know here in Kabul, and that's what is happening.
Well, as Afghanistan is often called the graveyard of empires, we'll keep looking at what could be the larger consequences for the U.S. of its quagmire there in Afghanistan. We're running out of time. We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us. Professor Nassiri joining us from Kabul, and also Professor Kuznick joining us from Washington. It's very early there in the morning. I appreciate you joining us this early, and also Professor Wanzing joining us in the Beijing studio. Thank you so much for coming. And that does it for this edition of Dialogue here on CGTN. We appreciate your time. We're going to see you next time. Bye for now.